What if the greatest military mind in history never won by fighting, but by refusing to? And what if the man who truly saved an entire civilization was called a coward for years before history proved him right? Welcome back. Today I want to walk you through one of the most extraordinary stories in all of military history. Not just a battle, not just a general, but a lesson about patience, strategy, and what it truly means to have the courage to stand still when everything around you is screaming to move. On August 2nd, 216 BC, the Roman Republic marched roughly 80,000 soldiers onto a flat, dusty plain near a small town in southeastern Italy. To put that number in perspective, that is more people than the entire population of many American cities today. They were confident, they were organized, and they were walking into the single worst military disaster in Roman history. By sundown that same day, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 of those men were dead, killed in a matter of hours on a patch of ground that Rome would not forget for generations. Senators, generals, 2 consuls, hundreds of the Republic's most prominent citizens, all gone before nightfall. Military historians still debate whether any army in the ancient world suffered a worse single-day loss. The answer, most of them agree, is probably not. Now here is where this story stops being just a tragedy and becomes something far more unsettling. Someone had warned them. Not in some vague prophetic way, not in a beware the Ides of March kind of warning. A Roman general had laid out, in plain, practical, strategic terms, exactly why sending 80,000 men into open battle against this particular enemy was going to end in catastrophe. He had not just predicted the disaster, he had explained, step by step, why the disaster was mathematically inevitable, given the circumstances. And the Roman Senate, the people, and even his own officers had essentially told him to sit down and be quiet. So here is what I want you to think about as we go through this together. How does the most strategically clear-thinking military mind of his era end up completely sidelined at the exact moment his strategy was most desperately needed? And why did it take one of the bloodiest single afternoons in ancient history before the people around him finally understood what he had been doing all along? Because the answer to those questions is not just a history lesson. It is a framework for thinking about leadership, patience, and decision-making under pressure that is just as relevant today as it was over 2,000 years ago. This is the story of the general who won by refusing to fight. Before we can understand why the strategy of patience was not just smart, but absolutely necessary, we first have to understand exactly who Rome was dealing with. Because without that context, everything that follows looks like timidity. With it, it looks like the only rational response to a nearly impossible situation. So let me take you back to where this all begins. He was born around 247 BC in Carthage, in what is modern-day Tunisia on the northern coast of Africa. His father was one of Carthage's greatest generals, a man who had fought Rome to a grinding standstill during the First Punic War. And according to the ancient historian Livy, when this boy was just 9 years old, his father took him into a Carthaginian sacrificial chamber, held him up before a burning altar fire, and made him swear an oath. Not a symbolic oath, a sacred, binding, lifelong oath of eternal enmity toward Rome. The boy reportedly answered, "As soon as age permits, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome." That was not just a dramatic moment for the history books. That vow shaped every single decision this man made for the rest of his life. And what makes it even more remarkable is what he actually went on to do with it. Before we go further, if you find this kind of deep military history and strategic thinking as fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an episode. We cover the moments, the decisions, and the people that literally changed the shape of the ancient world. Now, back to the story. By his late 20s, this general was commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain, and he was already showing something rarer than tactical brilliance or personal bravery. He had a genuine strategic imagination. He did not just want to win battles, he wanted to win a war. And in 218 BC, he did something that nobody, including Rome, considered seriously possible. He marched an army of roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants from Spain through southern France, across the Pyrenees, along the Rhone River, and then over the Alps into northern Italy. Let that sink in for a moment. Over the Alps, in late autumn, with war elephants. The crossing alone is one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in ancient military history. By the 9th day of climbing, his soldiers were exhausted and losing hope. He rode to the front of the column, halted the army, and pointed down to the Po Valley of Italy spread out below them, telling his men that from that point on, everything would be easier. But the descent was actually steeper and more treacherous than the climb. When a massive landslide blocked the path entirely, he ordered his engineers to build fires directly against the rock face, then pour vinegar over the heated stone to crack it open, creating a path wide enough for the elephants to pass through. Those elephants, by the way, each required around 220 pounds of food per day, which was nearly impossible to source in those frozen mountains. And historians now believe they were likely a smaller, extinct subspecies of African elephant, not the Asian variety most people picture. He started that crossing with over 70,000 men. He descended into Italy with roughly 26,000 battle-hardened survivors. And then, almost immediately, he started winning. At the Trebia River, in late 218 BC, he lured an overconfident Roman army into a freezing winter crossing and destroyed it. Around 20,000 Romans died. A few months later, he executed what remains one of the largest and most perfectly constructed ambushes in military history, concealing 55,000 troops in fog-shrouded hills above a narrow lakeshore road, waiting for a Roman column of 30,000 men to march blindly into the trap. The Romans were hit from 3 sides simultaneously, trapped between the hills and the water. 15,000 men were killed in under 4 hours. The Roman consul commanding them died in the fighting. Thousands more drowned trying to swim to safety. The lake itself reportedly ran red with blood. After that, he did something psychologically brilliant that most generals would never think to do. He released all of his non-Roman Italian prisoners and sent them home, deliberately planting seeds of doubt inside Rome's alliance network, which was the very foundation the Republic depended on. Rome had now lost 2 major armies in the space of months. The city was in genuine panic. And the man who had caused all of it was less than 100 miles from the city walls. Now, this is the moment where the story takes a turn that I think you are really going to find fascinating. This is the moment the Roman Senate made a decision they had not made in over a century. They activated one of the most unusual mechanisms in the entire history of democratic governance. The Roman Republic had an actual constitutional provision for exactly this kind of crisis. When the survival of the state was genuinely at risk, they could suspend normal governmental processes and appoint a single man with near absolute military and civil authority for a maximum of 6 months. The title was dictator, and the man they chose was already in his early 60s, which in the ancient world was genuinely old. He was a former consul, a man of deep religious conviction, and someone who had spent decades carefully watching Roman armies succeed and fail. His full name would eventually carry an additional word that started as an insult and became one of the most honored titles in Roman history. That word was cunctator. In Latin, it means the delayer. He did not earn that nickname as a compliment. Not at first. But here is what made this man different from every other Roman commander of his era. When he assessed the situation, he did it with a kind of cold, clear, almost surgical precision that tends to get mistaken for timidity by people who lack it. He identified 3 things almost immediately. First, the enemy's army was extraordinarily dangerous in open pitched battle, and their cavalry in particular was vastly superior to anything Rome could put on a flat field. Second, this enemy was operating deep inside Italian territory, without a reliable supply line back to Carthage. Third, and this is the crucial one, this enemy needed either a decisive victory that forced Rome to negotiate peace, or the mass defection of Rome's Italian allies. Neither of those things was going to happen, as long as his army was slowly being starved and worn down in the Italian countryside. So he made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He decided not to fight. He took his army into the hills above the enemy's line of march. He watched. He followed at a careful distance. He cut off foraging parties. He ambushed supply trains. He picked off isolated detachments when the terrain gave him the advantage. But he refused, absolutely and without exception, every single invitation to engage on open ground, where the enemy's cavalry would be decisive. The rugged hill country of Samnium and Campania in south-central Italy became his battlefield, not the flat plains where his opponent wanted to fight. And the strategy was, in hindsight, genuinely elegant. The difficult terrain neutralized the most dangerous weapon in the enemy's arsenal. It forced their army to spread out and forage in smaller groups, which made those groups vulnerable. And most importantly, it gave him the one resource his opponent could not replenish: time. But here is the part of this story that I find most remarkable, and I want you to really sit with this for a moment. Because the strategy was working. It was visibly, demonstrably working. And almost nobody around him believed in it. The complaint started almost immediately. The people of Rome, watching their allies' farms burn while their own army sat in the hills doing nothing, began to lose faith. And then his opponent did something that showed just how psychologically sophisticated he truly was. He understood that he could not break this strategy militarily, so he decided to break it politically instead. He marched his army through Campania, one of the most fertile and prosperous regions in all of Italy, burning and looting everything in his path. But he gave one very specific order. The estate belonging to the Roman dictator was to be left completely untouched. Not a fence disturbed, not a single crop burned. The message to Rome was unmistakable and devastating. Either the Roman dictator was a coward who refused to protect his own citizens from a foreign invader, or he had some kind of secret arrangement with the enemy. It was one of the most brilliant acts of psychological warfare in the ancient world, and it nearly worked. His own second-in-command, a man named Minucius Rufus, was openly and loudly contemptuous of the entire strategy. He wanted to fight. He said so constantly and publicly. When the dictator briefly left the army to perform religious rites back in Rome, Minucius took a detachment and attacked a portion of the enemy force, achieving what looked like a minor tactical success. Rome exploded with enthusiasm. The people, desperate for good news after months of humiliation, elevated Minucius to co-equal authority with the dictator. Think about what had just happened. The Romans had found a constitutional workaround to their own appointed dictator, because his strategy was too patient and too boring for the national mood. It is one of the most remarkable examples of democratic impatience in all of recorded history. But the dictator did not blow up. He did not retaliate. He watched Minucius carefully, and he waited. A few weeks later, the enemy, who had been studying Minucius just as carefully, set a trap. He positioned a hidden force in terrain that looked favorable for an attack, and let Minucius see what appeared to be a vulnerable enemy position. Minucius charged in. The trap closed. Minucius was surrounded and on the verge of total annihilation when the dictator appeared with the rest of the Roman army and rescued him. Minucius returned command immediately, reportedly calling his superior his father, in recognition of the fact that this man had just saved both his life and his army. It was a complete and public vindication of exactly the strategic patience that Minucius had spent months mocking. And yet, despite all of that, the 6-month constitutional limit was approaching, and Rome's political culture, as we are about to see, was still not built for patience. What happened next set the stage for the worst single day in Roman military history. When the dictatorship ended and Rome returned to its normal system of elected consuls, the Republic chose two men to lead its armies for the year 216 BC. One of them had campaigned loudly and aggressively on a promise to end the war decisively, to stop chasing the enemy through the hills, and to bring him to battle on the open plain, where Rome's superior numbers would simply overwhelm him. The other was more cautious, more measured. Someone who apparently had genuine sympathy for the patient strategy that had just been abandoned. But under the Roman system, the two consuls alternated daily command of the army, and on August 2nd, 216 BC, it was the aggressive one's day to command. He ordered the attack. And what followed is still studied in every serious military academy in the world, including right here in the United States. Not as a model to imitate, but as a warning to never forget. The battlefield itself was selected by the enemy, and that fact matters enormously. The site near the town of Cannae, in the Apulia region, was perfectly flat, wide open terrain that was ideal for cavalry movement. A hot, dry, dusty summer wind, called the Vulturnus, blew directly into the faces of the advancing Roman soldiers, stinging their eyes and filling their mouths with grit before they had even raised a weapon. And the enemy commander deployed his forces in a way that looked, on the surface, almost reckless. He placed his weaker allied infantry in the center of his line, bowing it forward toward the Romans in a shallow crescent shape. His best, most battle-hardened veterans he positioned on both flanks. His cavalry, the finest in the ancient world at that moment, anchored both wings. When the Roman legions pushed forward with their usual confidence, they drove directly into the soft center of that crescent. The center bent. It absorbed the Roman advance. It pulled back, slowly, deliberately, in controlled retreat rather than collapse, drawing the entire Roman formation deeper and deeper into a narrowing pocket. And this is the tactical detail that most people miss when they hear this story. If that center had broken and run, rather than retreating in disciplined order, the entire plan would have collapsed. The flanking veterans would have had nothing to pivot against. Every single piece of the design had to work with perfect timing and coordination. And it did. The flanks swung inward. The cavalry, having already routed Rome's mounted forces on both sides of the field, came around behind. The Romans were encircled completely. 80,000 men packed so tightly together that soldiers in the interior of the formation could not even raise their arms to fight back. Their short swords, designed for disciplined, open combat, became useless in the crush of bodies. What followed was not a battle, in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a systematic killing operation that lasted most of that afternoon. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died at Cannae. One consul was killed on the field. The other survived and fled. 80 senators were among the dead. Hundreds of men from Rome's equestrian class, the backbone of its administrative and military leadership, were gone in a single afternoon. The city of Capua, one of the largest and most strategically important cities in all of Italy, defected to the enemy. When the news reached Rome, the city fell into something close to collective psychological breakdown. Now here is the pivot that defines this entire story, and I want you to pay very close attention to this moment. After the battle, the enemy's officers urged him to march immediately on Rome. The road was open. The city was in chaos. His most brilliant cavalry commander reportedly told him directly, "You know how to win a victory, but you do not know how to use one." And the enemy commander refused to march. Why? Partly because he lacked the heavy siege equipment needed to breach Rome's walls. Partly because he was still hoping that Rome's Italian allies would defect en masse and simply hand him the city, without a siege. And partly because even after the greatest single-day tactical victory in ancient history, his own army had taken casualties it could not easily replace, and his supply lines back to Carthage were dangerously thin. In other words, exactly the structural vulnerabilities that the patient old general in the hills had identified from the very beginning was still there, every single one of them. Cannae was the highest point this enemy would ever reach. and from that peak, there was nowhere to go but down. Rome finally listened. The Senate did not reappoint the patient general as dictator, but his strategic approach became the official Roman strategy for the remainder of the war in Italy. No more open-pitched battles. Harassment, attrition, cutting supply lines, methodically retaking cities that had defected. And then came the man who would take that foundational logic and build something extraordinary on top of it. He was young by Roman standards, dangerously confident in ways that made older senators deeply uncomfortable. But he had been at Cannae as a junior officer. He had survived. He had watched the entire catastrophe unfold from close range, and he had spent years studying what it meant. He had looked at everything the enemy did, at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, and he had drawn a conclusion that was both bold and deeply rooted in the patient strategy that preceded him. If the enemy could not be beaten in Italy, then the answer was to attack Carthage directly. Force him to come home to defend his own city. Take the war to Africa on Rome's terms. In 204 BC, he landed in North Africa with a Roman army. It worked exactly as he had predicted. The undefeated general was recalled from Italy, where he had spent 15 years without ever being driven out by force, to defend the city of Carthage itself. And in October of 202 BC, on a North African plain near a place called Zama, the two greatest military minds of the ancient world finally met, face to face. The enemy opened with 80 war elephants, a terrifying psychological weapon designed to shatter Roman lines before the infantry even engaged. But the young Roman commander had prepared brilliantly. He arranged his infantry formations in straight, open corridors, allowing the elephants to pass through harmlessly. Roman trumpeters blasted their instruments at full volume, causing many of the animals to panic and wheel around directly into their own Carthaginian cavalry, disrupting their formations before the battle had even properly begun. When the Roman and Numidian cavalry, having routed the Carthaginian horsemen on both wings, returned to the battlefield and struck the enemy rear, the result was inevitable. The army that had never been defeated in a major engagement on Italian soil was encircled and broken by the very same double envelopment tactic it had used to destroy Rome at Cannae 14 years earlier. The Second Punic War was over, and the strategy that made that final victory possible did not begin at Zama. It ran in a direct, unbroken line back to an old man in the Italian hills, watching and waiting and refusing, day after day and month after month, to give his enemy the battle he wanted. Let me tell you something that I think is the most quietly devastating part of this entire story. The patient general died in 203 BC, just 1 year before the final victory at Zama. Ancient sources tell us he died in poverty because he had sold his own land to ransom Roman prisoners of war, and the Senate never reimbursed him. He was around 80 years old. He had been consul 5 times, dictator twice, and the man most responsible for keeping Rome alive during the most dangerous years of the entire war. And he had spent most of that time being called a coward by the very people whose armies were being destroyed because they refused to listen to him. That is not just a historical footnote. That is one of the most human things about this entire story. Now here is what makes this more than just ancient history, and why I believe this story matters deeply to us today, right here in America. The strategic logic that this old Roman general discovered over 2,200 years ago has been rediscovered independently by some of the most consequential military leaders in our own history. And none of them are more relevant to us as Americans than George Washington. Think about the situation Washington faced during the Revolutionary War. His Continental Army could not consistently beat British regulars in a straight-pitched battle on open ground. The British were better trained, better equipped, and far more experienced in the kind of formal European battlefield warfare that the era demanded. Washington knew this, and on September 8, 1776, he wrote a letter to John Hancock that reads almost like it could have come from the hills of Campania 2,000 years earlier. He wrote that they should, on all occasions, avoid a general action, and never put anything at risk unless forced by absolute necessity. His own aide, Alexander Hamilton, writing from New Jersey in June of 1777, put it even more directly. He wrote that the liberties of America are an infinite stake, and that they should not play a desperate game with something so precious, or put it on the outcome of a single roll of the dice. Both men understood something that is genuinely hard to hold on to when you are under pressure. Survival is a strategy. Existing is winning, when your opponent needs you to disappear. Washington's critics called him Fabius. They did not mean it kindly. They wanted aggressive action. They wanted decisive battles. They wanted the kind of dramatic victory that would make great paintings. What they got instead was an army that refused to die, a general who chose to reign carefully, retreated when necessary, struck only when conditions were favorable, and ground down British willingness to continue the war over years rather than months. History judged it rather differently than his critics did. And this brings me to what I believe is the deepest lesson in this entire story, the one I want you to carry with you long after this episode ends. There is a particular kind of moral courage that almost never gets recognized in the moment. It is the courage to sit still when everything around you is screaming to move. It is the courage to absorb criticism, to watch things you care about, suffer in the short term, and to hold your position because your analysis of the long-term situation is sound, even when nobody around you believes it yet. That kind of courage does not make great paintings either. It does not generate headlines. It does not get statues built in the town square while the battle is still happening. But it wins wars. The greatest battlefield tactician the ancient world ever produced crossed the Alps with elephants, won at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, spent 15 years in the heart of enemy territory, and was never defeated in a major engagement on Italian soil. And he lost the war to a patient old man who refused to fight him on his terms. Strategy, played long enough, beats tactics almost every single time. That is not just a lesson from 216 BC. That is a truth about how the world actually works, in business, in politics, in leadership, and in life. Do not fight the battle your opponent wants you to fight. Fight the one you can win, even if that means not fighting at all for a while. And if someone calls you a coward for it, just wait. The results have a way of speaking clearly enough on their own. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a great time to do it. We bring you stories like this every week. The decisions, the strategies, and the human moments that shaped the ancient world and still echo in our lives today. I will see you in the next one.